Welcome to the Chief Executive Officer or Chief Executive Officer course. This is the first session of the course, traditionally held in this format. Today we'll discuss what this role is all about, what they do, what they should know, how they differ from others, and so on. We'll also touch on trends today. Why is it necessary to take a course for Chief Executive Officers? First, the Chief Executive Officer, who is in charge of all aspects of the company, is responsible for the ultimate financial success of the business and its growth. The right approach and focus will allow the business to stop stagnating and finally start moving forward. In other words, the development of the Chief Executive Officer is, quite literally, the development of the business. Therefore, I believe that one of the best investments for company shareholders is in the education of Chief Executive Officers. This course has a website, and this is what it looks like. I'll tell you a bit about myself, in case we haven't met. My name is Mike Pritula. I've worked for various companies. Here they all are on the screen, with different Chief Executive Officers. We are now developing Michael Adami in the role of founder and also the key person in this organization. In my work, I rely on best practices. Here's the list right here. And I'd be glad if you could write about yourself too, what your role is. Meanwhile, I'll talk about the diploma and homework. So, there's homework in this course, and it will all be practically oriented. By completing them, we'll be able to issue a diploma on a modern, cool platform called ACD, where even Google issues its diplomas. Our course consists of 10 such focused sessions. Today we're talking about the role as a whole. Then we'll start with strategy and vision formation for the company, followed by discussions on leadership and team, then about product development, sales and marketing, then we'll cover the topic of finance, then how to effectively make decisions, how to implement changes and transform the business. Of course, we won't ignore the topic of artificial intelligence in business. In fact, just today there was news that Google is cutting a huge number of marketers due to automation, including because of artificial intelligence. And the 10th session will be dedicated to the interaction between the Chief Executive Officer and the Chief Operating Officer, because this partnership is very important. That is, a Chief Executive Officer alone is not enough, and even the Chief Executive Officer's profile is usually focused more on things related to business development. There needs to be someone who maintains the business and improves its efficiency. That's why the Chief Operating Officer is a very important person here, and we'll talk about that. Today, our session will be dedicated to a deep understanding of the Chief Executive Officer's role in an organization. What competencies this person needs, what are the main available tools and management methods, and we'll finish with a checklist to assess the effectiveness of the Chief Executive Officer's management activities. I'll share this checklist, and you'll be able to fill it out and identify your areas for development, where you're not yet doing things that could be done, so you can start thinking about it and working on it. So let's get started. Let's start a bit with trends. There's something about trends or research on Chief Executive Officers, what they think. It's a super popular topic for McKinsey, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, and a huge number of other companies are constantly surveying Chief Executive Officers about something. When I was sitting there looking at some studies, to be honest, I even got tired. But first of all, I'm tired of it all being the same. Secondly, it keeps repeating year after year. Well, it got a little boring. So, after flipping through all these studies again and rereading them, I chose one by McKinsey, which seemed like a breath of fresh air to me. I decided to rely on it and talk to you about 8 trends that I liked, which speak about the work of Chief Executive Officers and what awaits them. The first is, of course, artificial intelligence, specifically generative artificial intelligence. It's about the fact that already half of Chief Executive Officers agree that it's inevitable and needs to be utilized, and many are already using it objectively. Among the popular applications are replacing manual work with process automation and content creation, areas where artificial intelligence has already proven itself effective, and everyone understands that this needs to be pursued and implemented. This cannot be ignored under any circumstances. That is, many already fear that if their company is not involved with artificial intelligence in any way, not testing it, not trying it out, then tomorrow my competitors will simply outpace me at such a rate that I won't be able to keep up. And that's correct, that's good. Next is digital transformation. In principle, it's been happening for a long time. So, digitalization, as it's called, is simply its continuation and an understanding that we're experiencing a digital revolution and need to stay on trend. The energy transition is about green technologies. Elon Musk wrote something recently that I really liked. He wrote something that I'll try to remember verbatim, though not exactly. The sun for planet Earth generates so much energy in 1 hour that it would be enough to cover all our needs for 1 year. The only thing is that we just don't know how to collect it yet. In other words, the amount we extract through solar panels is very small, and there are many examples. Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was governor of California, implemented a program about 10 years ago called Million Solar Roofs. They're being built in Germany. I believe it was written about Germany that at peak times, when it's sunny, solar panels generate energy in the summer for almost all the needs that the country has at that moment. The problem is that they don't generate at night, they don't generate well in winter, but at a global level, we can solve everything. A company's unique abilities are about constantly searching for what makes us better, what sets us apart, in a world where, they say everything can be copied. And you see how the Chinese do it, copying everything. So it's a trend for every company to find that unique sauce that can set them apart. Unlocking the potential of middle management, that means working with them, betting on them, not on the top tier, but on the middle tier. Geopolitical risks. In the world today, as you can see for yourself, there are constant conflicts, geopolitical ones between countries, sorting out relationships, and companies need to take this into account. And it's expected that in the near future, all this will be happening quite actively between different countries. Bold growth and constant development, along with a new perspective on macroeconomics and taking into account what's happening there, also continues. These are the trends that McKinsey wrote about recently at least, and how I've seen them in the research of a huge number of other companies. But if you want to read more, check out the ones I've seen. I liked Gartner, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and KPMG. After McKinsey, if you want to look at any others, those would probably be the ones. Although if you're looking for research trends, there are tons. Now, regarding the role, we know that the general director is called the Chief Executive Officer, or CEO. Sometimes they're called the company president. I've encountered that and continue to encounter it. Some people like to be called that. Still, the more classic term is CEO, Executive Officer. There's also the chairman of the board, and others, I'm not sure. Anyway, in most cases, it's CEO. He works with a team of other people who might also be called C-level executives, or maybe not quite. This structure, we will now try to figure out what role belongs to whom. But when I saw a typical organizational structure, when I was thinking about how to explain the role of a chief executive officer, I wanted to draw my own structure. I thought about drawing arrows at first. Then I thought that in a chief executive officer's work, it is not even arrows, it is chaotic movement. That is, the chief executive officer, I even depicted him as a superhero, interacts with a huge number of people, not just the team. First of all, the shareholders. Some chief executive officers are lucky. They do not have shareholders because they are the shareholders themselves. And for others, it is the opposite. Besides managing the company, I also need to think about investments, how to attract them, and so on. And even if the chief executive officer is a shareholder, there might be external investors, and there could be other co-founders as well. Government authorities, in one form or another, require interaction. Counterparties and partners we interact with, employees, it is impossible to ignore them. Special executives, competitors, we need to find ways to interact with them, and customers. This is the real structure of a chief executive officer's interactions. Very complex, but that is how it is. Now let us talk about how the roles are divided. Okay, the chief executive officer's role becomes clear when we consider everyone's role, because, well, you know what a chief executive officer is? The one in charge of everything. But does that mean they should be mopping the floors? Probably not. By understanding what other people should be doing, we can figure out what is left for the chief executive officer. But let us start with the chief executive officer and their mission. The main mission, the primary task of this person, is to unite the team around the company's mission. Therefore, the chief executive officer's role is to define the vision, build an excellent leadership team, and provide them with the resources necessary for success. No founder starts as a pure chief executive officer. They start as managers, and over time, they delegate more responsibilities to make room for strategic thinking. And some, unfortunately, never get to that point. There is a term for it, getting bogged down in operations. And they say, I want to get out of operations. By the way, this is when they usually hire a chief operating officer. And that's the right decision. Recruiting, team training, and managing key relationships with investors and partners. Metrics. There's a so-called North Star metric for the company. Every company has one super important metric that they're fighting for. Then there's the dashboard or scorecard, usually based on the business model, and the runway, which is the number of months of cash reserves in the bank. So they say it's an important metric. When it's not Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. When Bill Gates was running the company, now he has a hired manager there, he's distant from it. He always had a requirement that the company should have enough money to last 1 year, preferably 2, even if there was no income. That's a plan. A common dilemma that often arises here is when there are multiple co-founders. Can they be the chief executive officer? And here's an interesting thing. Sometimes there's a concept of a chief commercial officer, that is a director, when there are several people, two people for example, become complementary chief executive officers. This is about the role of the chief executive officer. But as I said, we can best understand the role of the chief executive officer when we look at the people around them. Well, more precisely, those who report to them. What do they do there, and what responsibilities do we subtract from the chief executive officer's role? First of all, the chief operating officer is an important person. Their main super mission is to ensure the smooth operation of the company, so they ensure the collaboration of the business model and the operating system, often serve as the chief executive officer's right hand and perform functions that the chief executive officer can't handle. They can lead non-production operations, manage projects, and in the early stages, they might even manage human resources, finance, and legal. Metrics include various operational key performance indicators, production efficiency, and functional key performance indicators. They can be diverse. A common dilemma is when to hire them. It's better to hire them early. Sometimes the chief operating officer can even be a co-founder. That happens too. Next is the person responsible for the product. This role can have different titles. In the IT business, they're called the chief product officer. In other businesses, it's a different role. For example, at a TV channel, it was called a program director. If it's not a television business, but a movie-related business, it would be an executive producer. Well, in different companies, it will be someone else. The chief designer or chief engineer is the one who envisions what the product should be like. So the CPO. The goal of the product team is to understand customer needs and transform them into valuable, usable, and actionable product requirements. The product team may include customer needs researchers, rapid prototyping specialists, designers, analysts, product owners, and so on. And to evaluate these guys, there are metrics, a cool metric set. A set of metrics from Google called HEART, which sounds like heart, but is an acronym. And here's an example: happiness, engagement, adoption, retention, and task success. And it often happens that the CEO wants to be or can be the product manager, but it's best to separate these roles. You know, Steve Jobs in fact always wanted to be CPO, but he had Jony Ive, who was responsible for product design. And we know that Steve Jobs as a director had difficulties. He was pretty good at coming up with products and developing innovations, but he managed the company poorly. When Tim Cook came in, I won't even say he's bad with innovations or design. That would be an understatement with a minus sign. I mean, he's catastrophically terrible at all of this. He's not about that at all, but he excels where Steve Jobs didn't. He's about maintaining the company, operational efficiency, and so on. And Apple is thriving. That's why it's important to keep these roles separate. The CEO is not responsible for the product, he's responsible for the entire company, while the person in charge of the product goes by different titles. Then it's good to have a CTO, someone who is responsible for technology, because it's one thing to be a visionary of what the customer needs and what the product should look like. It's another thing to be a designer and understand how to develop all this technologically. So again, it can be called differently in various companies, but even in television, for example, it's a technical director. In a banking environment, it would be someone responsible for banking processes. In other words, it can be called something else. In a bank, it's probably more like an information technology director, because banking business is about information technology technologies and information technology processes. Next, there's the Chief Growth Officer, the head of growth. This role doesn't always exist, and actually, I'd say that's a shame. The information technology business has already realized that this is a very cool role, but the only thing is that they don't always call it Chief Growth Officer. It's also called Growth Hacker or Growth Hack. Even if you don't look too hard, you can find it. For example, we had such a person at Apple. He considered himself a growth hacker. As he was called in Apple, he was called something like Chief Growth. That's what I don't remember. His task is very interesting. He's not a marketer, he's not a product, he's somewhere at the intersection. And his task, through experiments and metrics, is to find a solution that would lead to exponential growth of the company. A very interesting role, and an important one. It can sometimes be coupled with the role of Chief Product Officer, or maybe with the role of a marketer. Well, it's not a bad idea to think of it as a separate role. Next is simply the Marketing Director, Chief Marketing Officer, Chief Marketing Officer. The task here is to attract customers. Again, it's different in different businesses. In online business, it's traffic. In offline business, it's also traffic, but people traffic different tools, different channels, different activities. But still, the work is similar. Here, they often have some overlap and conflict with the Chief Product Officer. In some companies, the marketer also acts as the person responsible for products. In some companies, these are separate roles. But the marketer's task is, generally speaking, to make customers buy the product, to bring them in. The product can be great, ideal, I don't know, perfect. But if there's no marketing, maybe no one even knows about it, or only a small circle of people knows about it. Therefore, the marketer's task is to make everyone know about it, and many want to buy it. Then there's an interesting title called Chief Revenue Officer, which better represents sales than the title Commercial Director, because when people say Sales Director or Commercial Director, they overlook the fact that this person is responsible for generating revenue. So it's very important to have this role and to understand its significance. And this role can manage different sales channels. Basically, it's a classic role. The only difference is that in online IT businesses, due to different sales methods, there might be slightly different focuses. For example, there's inbound sales, outbound sales, where they call these roles sales development representative or sales development executive. So there are nuances with sales, job titles, and specifics, but everything is important. Next, there's the person who supports customers. This role is correctly called the Chief Customer Officer. This is the person responsible for ensuring that customers are not only satisfied, but also successful in their interactions with the company's products or services. Again, this role is often found within marketing or as a separate entity. It can also include community management, so that's the function. Next is the CFO Finance, probably the most classic function. This role is more or less the same for everyone. There's not much to add here. Obviously, the CEO won't be handling this personally. With HR, it's all clear. They're responsible for people, recruiting, training, developing, motivating, rewarding, and so on. People often ask when it's worth hiring HR. Some companies operate for a long time without HR and even build large businesses. Some hire HR right away. I know companies where HR professionals are the founders. For example, someone left corporate business, suggested to an HR professional to create a company together, and they start the company as a duo. The HR person quickly recruits everyone, while the other person takes care of the business side. So this does happen. It happens. I was consulting with some guys yesterday. They said, we didn't understand for a long time why we needed one. We already had 100 people, and we were basically managing on our own. But then we realized, and then, as the memes say, I couldn't understand, didn't get it for a long time, then suddenly it clicked. It happens. That's about the role. So now there's an understanding of who's responsible for what, and what the CEO is responsible for. The CEO, can be compared. These guys are like musicians playing different instruments, and the chief executive officer is like a conductor, not just conducting but also producing this entire orchestra. Everyone is responsible for making sure the orchestra plays and generates revenue. That's the role of the chief executive officer. What competencies does a chief executive officer need? The competencies of a chief executive officer are actually a problem, because there's no such thing as a standardized chief executive officer competency model. I've been trying to find one for years, and it's still interesting to me what I might discover. Whether someone creates one or not, there's also a problem with leadership competency models in general. But fortunately, I managed to find a great framework, a really cool system. It was developed by the Institute of Directors, an interesting organization. They developed the profession of director in the broadest sense of the word. Not just chief executive officer, but it could be a board director as well. It's just such a high-level position. They have a great competency model. I really liked it. It's very clear, I agree, and I'd like to share it with you. This model is built on 3 main areas. These are the necessary knowledge areas, but I'll be speaking in the context of a chief executive officer. Skills or experience required for the position, and mindset or way of thinking. And now, let's look at what's included here in more detail. Again, I won't read out every point in detail, I'll focus on the main aspects. First is corporate governance, that is, the ability to build and manage organizational structures. In fact, many don't know how to do this, so it's called corporate governance. Many build a company, even if they're hired managers, with the mindset of, I'm the gang leader here, and everyone works for me. Not realizing that, first of all, mid-level managers are not just executors. And for top-notch leaders, I believe even this management style is not suitable. Secondly, if their experience, knowledge, capabilities, and intelligence are properly utilized and corporate governance is correctly organized, they will lead the company to success, because the decisions that will be made, the ideas that will be generated and so on, will be much more impressive than if the chief executive officer tries to do everything on their own. Therefore, the chief executive officer's task is to create corporate governance by selecting the right people for this corporate governance system. What then takes shape as some kind of board of directors or board? In other words, this could be the formation of an external board of directors. Well, yes, shareholders are largely involved in this, but the chief executive officer should also be pretty good at dealing with shareholders in this regard. For example, here's a good example: Igor Smelyansky, chief executive officer of Ukrposhta. He effectively interacts with the board of directors, and as far as I understand, he recommended some people, well-known figures to manage it. Sometimes it can simply be shareholders to whom the chief executive officer reports, but it's also important to know how to work with them and engage them in a way that they make decisions and provide support. If, for example, there's a holding company, there are often people there who are responsible for the fate of the business, who hire the chief executive officer and set goals for them, and it's about the ability to work with these people. This could be internal management or an internal board of directors, and it could simply be a team of managers who, without any fancy titles, are managed by the chief executive officer. In short, it needs to be built. Some chief executive officers effectively invite advisors and work with them in a kind of corporate governance system. For example, when I worked in gaming, it was a private company, and the chief executive officer was one of the founders, Victor Kisley. He created a management system for himself, where he hired top managers and took on several advisors. In other words, he chose people for himself, whom he trusts, values their interesting expertise, called them advisors, and created a system where this advisor doesn't manage anything in the company and has no employees. But they participate in corporate governance, make decisions, take part in decision-making, advise, and may separately implement some small projects, or be a sponsor of a project. This is an important function. This is, of course, probably for larger companies. Although, for example, when I worked at Pepli company, Kirill Begay was the chief executive officer. I joined when there were 5 people, and we grew to 100 people in 6 months. He formed something like a corporate governance structure from the shareholders who invested in the company. In other words, he had an external advisory board with whom he made decisions. That's the point. So that's what we've discussed. That's the first point. The first piece of knowledge. The second is leadership and relationships with all stakeholders. But obviously, the role of the chief executive officer is the most leadership-oriented role in the company. It's not just about knowing, being able to, and practicing leadership. It's much more significant and important because you also need to be an example. In other words, besides being a leader for employees, so that they follow you and you inspire them, and increasing their effectiveness, you also need to show other managers what kind of leader one should be. That is, you need to be a role model. But this includes understanding things like values, culture, leadership, and working with shareholders, among other things. Then there's strategy. This is when a person actually develops a plan to beat the competition. In essence, if you look at business from a high and distant perspective, it's a struggle for resources. There's a customer market. This market currently belongs to someone, and you need to take it away from other people. Yes, there's the blue ocean strategy where a market is essentially created, but that's an illusion because this blue ocean is filled with money that comes from somewhere. In other words, money flows in from other markets. So it's also a struggle. And in any struggle, in any battle, strategy is important. A plan to win the fight, both in the short and long term. Therefore, the CEO's task is to understand strategy very well, to know how it's formed, how it works, how it adapts, and so on. Without a strategy, the CEO will either rely on luck and good fortune, or sometimes the company will seize an opportunity, achieve something and hold on, but only for a while, until someone else comes along who will realize their own opportunity or who will devise a strategy and simply take over this market. That's why strategy is important here. Next is finance. Although the CEO is not the CFO and they have a CFO, business is, let's say, an entity that speaks the language of money, and it's impossible, simply impossible to ignore this or not speak the language of money. Therefore, the CEO must be well versed in finance. Of course, they won't be an expert in international financial reporting standards or in building complex financial models, but they need to know the basics. Next are skills. This includes strategic thinking, meaning here we're talking more about the technology of strategy development, about processes, about the type of thinking, in other words, big picture thinking. I might even rephrase it that way. Then there's the analysis and use of information. Modern business relies on information. There's a lot of information. You need to know how to work with it, how to obtain it, how to use it, and how to draw conclusions. Then there is decision making. Many executives in the company are very fortunate. If they are uncertain, if they do not know, they can go to the CEO to make the decision for them. Many abuse this privilege. But they have someone to turn to, the CEO, unless they go to the shareholders, but that is not always possible. First, shareholders will not make all the decisions. Second, shareholders may not like it. But there is no time to wait for shareholders to make a decision. So the CEO should be, a perfect decision-making machine. For example, here is what artificial intelligence cannot do right now. It cannot make decisions at all. That is, if you phrase the question slightly differently, it will make a completely different decision in the same situation. Generate ideas? Sure. Generate text? No problem. Provide options? Certainly. Artificial intelligence can do many things, but it cannot make decisions. and will not learn to do so anytime soon because it is an art. The CEO must be proficient in this. Communications. Since business is largely built on human interaction, and human interaction is communication, the CEO must be able to do this, otherwise everything will stall and nothing will work. Next is leadership. Earlier it was mentioned as a direction, but here it is about the required skill. Well, that is clear, understood, and influence. Another important competency is the ability to influence even rank-and-file employees, especially for those companies working with the younger generation. When I worked at ID, for example, we had several people from the Generation Z generation, including in my team, and it was very interesting for me to observe how Generation Z does not hold the CEO in high regard. If they disagree, they express their arguments and expect the CEO to convince them otherwise or not. The fact that the CEO is the big boss, pays their salary and so on, they do not care about that. So that is my opinion on this. Convince me that you will fire me. Well, all right, okay. First, it is a strike against you and your reputation if you fire someone for their opinion. Secondly, it's not a problem to find a job when you've just graduated, full of energy and so on. And you're generally experimenting with life. That's why chief executive officers need to have influence, not just because of their position, like I'm the big boss, please listen to me, but the ability to persuade and convince even junior employees who are just starting out. The next point is about ethics, about manner, about mindset. Why ethics? I believe that many, let's say, unethical people often win in the short term, and I can say from experience they even outperform ethical people, because cheating or doing something underhanded can bring short-term benefits. But in the long run, it's believed that an unethical approach doesn't win. Then there's professionalism. It's the understanding that I must develop, I must grow, I must be the best version of myself, and so on. Focus on efficiency or productivity, meaning the understanding that we must improve, we must be effective. Independence, the ability to be autonomous, the ability not to depend on shareholders or anyone else. Self-awareness and awareness of others. This is about emotional intelligence, self-understanding, self-awareness, and so on. These are the competencies needed. These are the requirements for this position. Now let's talk about the main management tools and techniques. Of course, the number of tools and management techniques that a chief executive officer can apply is enormous, or for example, those that a manager can apply. It's very difficult to pick just 10 here. For example, we have a people management course, and in general, many dozens of courses where we have to talk about 10 tools for managers. That's how hard it is to pick 10 out of about 100, roughly. It's even harder for a chief executive officer because their position is even broader. The number of available tools, management methods, and so on in the company is even greater. So it's difficult to choose just 10. For example, what could these 10 be? Let's try to make this attempt. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis as a universal tool. That is, the ability to constantly analyze the strengths and weaknesses of a company, business, strategy, idea, anything, as well as opportunities and threats. Then it's very important to work with metrics, that is, to build a system of indicators, the ability to work with objectives and key results, to set goals for yourself and your team for 3 months, and to achieve them. Lean production, meaning continuous efficiency improvement, reducing unnecessary waste, Scrum and methodologies. These are the so-called agile management methodologies. Strategic planning, coaching and mentoring, working with CRM systems, ERP systems, and data-driven decision-making. These are probably the main management tools and methods that a chief executive officer needs to master. And finally, the promise checklist. Again, the position is very broad, and to choose certain things that should be in a chief executive officer's work, to reduce this number to 50 items, as in this checklist, it's difficult, because there could be thousands and thousands of possible items that we could check. So here's a decent attempt to focus on some 50 core components that should be in the chief executive officer's focus and should be present in the company. I recommend filling out this checklist to see what's missing and what needs to be added to make your company successful. It will be available via the link here. Please fill it out. The homework for those on the course is to fill out the checklist to assess effectiveness and write down which areas need development. You see, as a chief executive officer, what areas, if developed, will allow the company to succeed the most? What will be covered in the second session? We'll further discuss strategy and vision, how it's developed, how it's built, what the chief executive officer needs to consider here. If you're not yet enrolled in our course, I invite you to take it. It's a condition for participation, and there are different packages available. There's a package with the chief operating officer, if you have one in your company. I recommend that the chief operating officer takes their course while you take yours. That would be ideal. If you have a sales director, they can take a course too. For everyone else, there's the People Management Master of Business Administration. That's how it is. That's all for now. Thank you to everyone who joined us online. I look forward to seeing you in the course. Have a good evening, everyone. For those already enrolled in the course, I'm looking forward to your homework assignments. That's all for now. Bye-bye.